Hello and welcome to the latest joint webinar between the International Compliance Association and LRN. I'm delighted that you can join us wherever you are in the world. My name is Pekka. I'm the president of the ICA, and we've got a great panel for you today. And we're going to dive into a really interesting topic focusing on effectiveness and mastering effectiveness of programs around ethics and compliance. And we're going to particularly look at it through a lens focused on the Asia Pacific region. But if you're not in the Asia Pacific, doesn't matter. We'd still love to hear from you as well. While we're starting, I guess it would be great to hear from you wherever you are in the world. Let us know whereabouts you are and say hello. See, Ali, an old colleague of mine in Birmingham. I hope the weather is treating you well. Mohammed in Kuwait, fantastic. Louisa, a couple of people in Dubai and Dali, welcome. Perez in Indonesia, fantastic. So wherever you are, thank you for joining. We would love to hear from you. We've just been chatting with the panel beforehand, and I think we all enjoy it when we hear questions. Please do share your thoughts, your comments, questions for our panel. Any context you have on the issues we're discussing, any challenges you have, it'd be lovely to hear from you. Such an important topic we're going to be discussing today. Can I ask you put your questions in the Q&A section rather than the chat? Just makes it easier for us to keep track of those as they come in. So I can see we've got a League of Nations panel coming in on the chat as well. Good to see a really diverse range. So before I hand over and introduce our panel, I guess I just want to position the context for today. And I think one of the striking things that I'm seeing evolve in compliance is that no matter what industry you're in, regulators, your stakeholders, they now know that you've got basic compliance controls in place. You've got a code of conduct. Usually you've got an anti-bribery and corruption policy. You train your staff on ethics and compliance issues. But the real lens and the focus now from regulators globally is how effective is your program and how can you demonstrate that effectiveness? And we'll see actually some really interesting themes around that. For example, one of the themes I know our panel will look at is people at different levels of organizations tend to have a very different view of how ethical and compliant your culture is. And unfortunately, the closer you get to the middle and the front lines, that level of optimism tends to decrease. So how can we maybe address that? I'm not going to steal Eric's thunder, who I'll introduce in a moment, about LRN. But if you're not familiar with LRN, they are a fantastic organization, got some amazing solutions, and they're doing some world-leading work around helping us with this really challenging issue of actually taking the pulse of the quality and effectiveness of our ethics and compliance programs. And I know they've been working on some really ground-leading research for, I think it's over 11, 12 years as well. And this year's report, I think, is interesting because it doesn't just survey ethics and compliance professionals, it actually goes to people in the business as well, which I think is fantastic. And if you're not familiar with the report I'm talking about, it's the 2025 Ethics and Compliance Program Effectiveness Report. And I'm sure we'll put some links into the report in the chat for you all as well. And again, Eric, I'm sure will give us some context around this report. If you've not read it, if you're not familiar with LRN, please do check them out. Okay, so I guess today we're going to focus on how do the best ethics and compliance programs actually measure their effectiveness? And we know that there is a real disparity around Asia Pacific and the world, from the high-performing compliance programs and the poor performing, and even the moderately successful ones. And then maybe we'll also kind of talk about that gap between employees and senior management. How do we bridge that gap? How do we grow that culture of ethics and compliance? And how do we measure it, really? I think some really interesting questions. One of the interesting topics we're going to discuss today is generational differences, as well as maybe cultural differences, and how we approach those as compliance and ethics professionals. So looking forward to the discussion today, I'd like to introduce my panel. And we'll just fire in the order that I have you guys, if that's okay. I'm going to start with you, June, if I may. Welcome along. Nice to see you from my hometown of Singapore. I'm currently speaking to you from New Zealand. So it's about 10 o'clock at night here. But June, thank you very much for joining us. June Lau is the head of compliance, State Street Bank and Trust Company, and head of APAC compliance for State Street. Is that right, June? I'm getting your title correct there, I hope. So
Yes,
June, tell us a little bit about yourself and your role.
Firstly, thanks to ICA for inviting me to the panel. It's an exciting topic and a great report to share. As you rightly pointed out, I cover compliance in APAC, working with State Street. Prior to my State Street life, I worked with BNP Paribas Security Services, also in compliance and financial crime. And prior to BNP, I was a regulator with the MAS, as well as a financial services auditor with one of the Big Four. Happy to be here.
Fantastic. So got great perspective that you can bring to today's discussion then, June. Thank you for joining us. Next, we've got Eric. Eric, welcome. Joining us at a very unsociable hour from the US. My goodness, you're looking really well, considering the time. But Eric, thank you so much for joining us. Eric Morehead is the Director of Advisory Services at LRN. So Eric, over to you to introduce yourselves to our panel, audience rather.
Sure. I'm Eric Morehead. I'm Director of Advisory Services at LRN. LRN is a provider of training and platform and compliance resources. And our advisory services team primarily focuses on helping clients with projects around their written standards and benchmarking, evaluating their programs. So everything other than the tools and the training that the people on the other side of the house at LRN do. My background, I started out as an attorney here in Texas about 20 some years ago, and did a stint with the U.S. Sentencing Commission here in the United States, which for those of you who've been in compliance in a while, you've probably heard of the Sentencing Commission because they were the first regulator in the United States to talk about what is an effective ethics and compliance program and put together some standards back in the early 90s. So I come from that background, kind of a regulatory background, but I've been working with clients to try to improve their programs for the last decade.
Fantastic, fantastic. Again, a really interesting background and perspective to bring today. And thank you for joining us. What is it, 4 o'clock in the morning for you? Something crazy. So
yeah, just a little early.
Yeah, really fantastic. And finally, last but not least, we have Darja. So Darja, thank you for joining us. So Darja Galante is an ethics and compliance leader. And she's focused, now based in Singapore, I believe, Darja, is that correct? Lots of experience across Asia. You've led compliance programs at various tech, med device and manufacturing listed multinationals, right across APAC. And, I think interesting to hear from you about what you're seeing, what you've seen in your career so far, and what good looks like in this space as well. So Darja, over to you, if you wouldn't mind just saying a little bit about yourself to the audience, please.
Thank you so much, Pekka. You've stolen my line, actually, literally, copy paste. So yeah, I've been around the Asia Pacific compliance block a few times, as you rightfully mentioned, in various industries, exciting industries, high-risk industries, with the last role being a regional compliance leader for LIXIL, though starting a new exciting challenge in a few weeks' time. So I guess I've spent enough time in APAC to have a strong opinion, on everything, starting from dim sums in Hong Kong or tax laws in Singapore. So looking forward to the discussion.
Fantastic, fantastic. Again, thank you very much for joining us. Okay, well, look, let's, I see we've had the chat, we've put the link into LRN's report as well. Thank you for our support behind the scenes who've done that. So seamless, well done. So I'm going to pass to Eric now. Eric's got a presentation to share, which is going to be really useful because I think it will give us panel the context to build our discussion around, really. So Eric, I'll pass over to you to kind of talk through the report and some of the key kind of takeaways. Yeah, Eric.
Sure, thanks. And hopefully everybody is able to see the presentation here. And it's coming through.
Yeah, we're good.
Great. I think, as you mentioned in the introduction, this is the 11th year that we have undertaken this research and put out a report. So we have a track record looking at these questions around effectiveness. But this is a unique year in that we, for the first time, not only surveyed 1,500 compliance professionals, but also 1,500 employees to get their perspective, so that we weren't just hyper-focused only on those responsible for the program, but those who are experiencing the program as well. And so that was a departure, and we got some really interesting data out of that, as we'll discuss here in a minute. But I do want to spend a second talking about our methodology, because I think even in the introduction you mentioned that the difference between a high performing program and a medium and a low performing program. So we have, over the years, over the past decade, developed a methodology so that we can kind of gauge differences between program maturity. A lot of surveys, go out and ask questions, and you can do demographic cuts and see, what organizations over a certain employee size or in a certain industry say, or a certain geographic region. But we wanted to be a little bit more deliberate about sorting out organizations that perhaps have invested more time and resources into their program and their culture, because we all know culture can eat compliance for breakfast. So having a strong culture is an important component of having an effective program. So what we've done over time is there are 3 areas that we've looked at. One is ethical decision making, and these are all screening questions, if you will, that we'll ask about a compliance program before we'll sort of rate it as a high, medium, or low performing program. So we'll ask questions about how ethical decision making happens in the organization, how choices are made. We also will make inquiry about organizational justice. Is everybody treated the same? High performers expected to meet the standards just like everyone else. And then the third area is speak up. Do people feel like they can come forward with concerns, with critique, and ideas for improving the program and the application of compliance at the organization? And based on those preliminary questions that we ask, we can then group organizations based on that in high, medium, and low performing or low maturity programs. And that allows us to make some comparisons, and that leads us to the main findings that we had in the 2025 report, and comparing those different groups, both those high performing, what we call high impact programs, versus those that maybe aren't investing, or aren't investing as much, or aren't quite as mature. And the first interesting one that we've noticed is what we're calling the benchmarking gap. And this is how organizations are leveraging technology, data analytics. Over here in the United States, but also around the world, regulators are asking more specific questions, we all know, in the last decade or so, about how you're measuring your program, the program's effectiveness, how you're monitoring what's going on in the organization. So what systems, what tools you have, and what data you're collecting. And what we found is there's almost a 2x gap. There's a 1.9x gap between those high impact programs and medium impact programs on utilizing those tools and utilizing that data. And that is growing a bit over the years as well. That also shows I think a gap in investment, right? Because a lot of this is about spending money so that you have the technology and tools to be able to gather that data and properly use that data to inform your choices on your program. Another key finding was what we're calling the perception gap on middle management. There is a wide gap in the perception of employees and professionals. Both agree on this in the ethical decision making or the trust in the ethical decision making of those in middle management versus executives. And this year that gap is double. And we're finding that people, particularly rank and file, particularly employees, are concerned about middle management and their ethical and whether they make decisions in line with the ethical values of the organization. And that number is particularly low. It's 37%. And this gap is growing too. This is another thing. Since we have the benefit of asking these questions over a decade, the gap here, it's now 2x between the perception of executives and the perception of middle managers. That gap was only just a little bit over 1. It was 1.3 in 2021. So there was a 23-point gap between how people perceived middle managers and executives with regard to ethical decision making in 2021, and it's jumped now to 42%. So over the past 5 years, there's been this widening gap in perception about particularly the focus on how middle managers are handling ethical decision making. So that's very troublesome because those are the managers and leaders that the rank and file are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So that is I think, to me, honestly, this is the most impactful piece of data that comes out of the report, because one of the things that I've been focusing on a lot over the 12, 13 years I've been advising organizations is how do you train the middle to be effective implementers of your program? Because if you don't have middle management buy-in for any initiative in any organization, you're just not going to accomplish your goals. And so this, to me, is a real, a red flag waving as to what organizations, particularly those that gap between high performing programs that are really focusing on culture and focusing on the middle and those in the middle that aren't. Another interesting finding that came out of the data is that high impact programs are overwhelmingly more likely to utilize misconduct trend and data to inform how they move forward with their program. I guess this is no surprise when you consider it really is in tandem with the first point about benchmarking and using data just generally. But again, we're seeing almost a 2x difference between those high impact programs and medium impact programs in how and whether they use misconduct trend data to make choices about training, tools, communication around important risk topics. That is particularly troublesome and worrisome, I think. Another key finding out of this report, and this I think is one of the good pieces of data that came out of us asking questions of rank and file, is there's a generational divide in perception around compliance. And we see this in social science over the past few years anyway, that there are kind of stark differences between the generation, but Gen Z are twice as likely versus Gen X or older boomer members of the organization, of these organizations, to perceive or have some skepticism about fairness overall, and particularly what the middle management and leadership of the organization have to say about ethics and compliance. And then one last takeaway I want to talk about this morning or this afternoon or this evening, as the case may be, is there is a gap also between in addressing emerging risks. And again, no surprise, a lot of these are resource issues, right? And so the focus, we're seeing a greater focus, almost or over 2.3x in high impact programs focusing on third party, on supply chain, on these emerging risks, particularly in international organizations. I think that we see that happening quite a bit. So since we're focusing on APAC, I did want to talk a little bit about the data that we're seeing on these points in the APAC region. For this survey this year, we have in our sample results from Singapore, Australia, and Japan. Singapore and Australia pretty much tracked fairly closely what we're seeing here in the overall global results, but we did see some outliers in Japan in particular, and I wanted to talk about those just really quickly. So again, the same points on that benchmarking gap. There is a substantially greater impact that we're seeing between the high impact and medium impact in the Japan data sample. And remember, this was like this was a 2x, and then we're seeing it almost 50% more, 2.6x difference between the high and medium impact programs as far as utilizing benchmarking data tools to evaluate the effectiveness of their program. Perception gap, Japan is actually just a little bit lower than the overall global average here. So slightly less difference between the perception of executives and middle management and their ethical decision-making in Japan. Looking at when you look at high impact programs in Japan, 69% of those programs will utilize misconduct trend data to make adjustments to their program or evaluate the effectiveness of their program, compared to a very low 27% of what we call medium impact programs looking at that data. So that is troubling and is pretty significantly different from what we're seeing globally. There's not quite enough data from the employee survey for us to make a direct comparison here, but one thing we did note when you're looking at generational differences in Japan is that managerial fairness across the board is perceived lower in Japan versus the 55% that we see as the mean in the global data. And then lastly, probably the biggest divergence here on these main findings in the report. In Japan, medium impact programs lag really significantly behind in looking at that emerging risk. So there's some blind spots here that we're seeing potentially, particularly for medium impact programs in Japan. So last thing I want to say before we jump into the discussion is what do we perceive are some positive takeaways for organizations in Asia-Pac to move forward here. Getting to the middle is a lot about messaging. Again, to me, the biggest red flag in this report globally is this divergence between the perception of ethical decision-making at the executive level versus the middle. And I think getting out there and reaching the middle, reaching the rank and file, and telling them about the importance of of everybody being, rowing in the same direction is important. A little spend in communication and training can yield great results, and we've seen that over and over. Use the tools that you have access to. We're not seeing a lot of adoption of using data tools. I'm not suggesting that everybody needs to go out there and spend a lot of money on new tools, but see what's available within the organization already. See what audit does. See what other functions in the organization do. And if there's something that you can adopt to better gather and utilize data. And related to that, collect what you can. Maybe you can't, you don't have the resources and the ability to collect all the data that you would like to in a perfect world to measure effectiveness, but see what you can get and start that process of being a little bit more data driven and more intentional in your programs. So that's just a quick rundown of kind of the main points here. We have the link, I think, in the chat to download the report. I encourage everybody to do that. If I don't get to your questions today, feel free to reach out to us at LRN, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about the report.
Thank you, Eric. A really good summary there, and lots to unpack in there, I think. And we're already getting quite a few questions coming in from the audience. So thank you, audience. Keep those coming. I want to go to our panel, though, first, before we take some questions, just to get some thoughts. Darja, I'll start with you, if I may. Should we start with the big point that Eric highlighted in the report, this disconnect between, I guess, perceptions and even reality, dare I say, of how middle management are acting, and are they, are they actually making significant business decisions based on ethical and compliance considerations? And that disconnect between the middle, it's getting stuck in the middle somehow, and versus the guys at the top and the front. Can you maybe give us some examples of your take on that, and what you see? Is middle management a weaker chain, and if so, what do we do about it?
Sure. Thanks, Pekka. Look, I think middle managers are definitely sort of the make it or break it layer for compliance culture specifically, especially in Asia, where the disconnect between leadership teams and the middle management is quite big. So if they feel like they're stuck between that ethics and performance, their default here will be to keep themselves safe, right? That's a natural instinct, I would say. But if we give them those right support tools, real tangible tools that work, I do think that middle management actually is the best driver of compliance culture forward. I guess one example, one case that stuck with me is a regional sales manager in one of the companies that reached out to me, and she was under tremendous pressure to approve a deal very quickly, so it had to go out. So technically, according to her, and we reviewed it, it complied with the policy, but then she had certain concerns. Somebody basically blew the whistle, said that the third party had major issues, reputational issues, tax liability, so we don't really want to engage with them. So she hesitated to escalate it because, in her words, it would slow things down, right? And leadership will think she's a weak chain, she's a business blocker. And honestly, that right there was the problem on its own, right? The culture said compliance is very important, it matters, please don't be afraid. But that unspoken pressure to deliver those results, right, was sending completely different message to her and to everyone else. So, the way we tackled it, and it took us some time to get there, is first we built a compliance into the performance review process, finally. And that's obviously not an innovative tool. I think many companies know they have to do that, but they hesitate to do that, right? So managers weren't just judged on hitting the targets, but also on how they actually hit them. Do they hit them in an ethical way? Do they support the compliance culture? So what we also did was to create the safe to say no framework, as we called it. So managers could flag concerns without an actually fear of retaliation or fear of looking different. It was a separate anonymous channel, nothing fancy, to be honest with you. So just an email channel, and compliance team had an access to it. Well, and finally, we did get executives to visibly support those decisions. I think key thing here is executives to walk the talk visibly, right? Often what happens, we do put it on our brochures and our trainings, but the executives remain silent. So I do think all of those three things definitely helped us to improve the situation. And in fact, the survey we did in a 3 or 4 months time, I believe, actually showed that proactive engagement. So that's probably the example I could think of on the top of my head.
So if I may,
Brilliant,
maybe
brilliant. Thank you. And I think, please, Jean, go ahead.
Yeah. Just to add to what Darja talked about in terms of the 3 points of supporting middle management, a couple of other things. I do think we need to equip our middle management with the knowledge of what exactly Darja, you mentioned ethical decision making framework. What does that mean, right? And getting them into workshops, training them, running through case studies and scenarios, making them think you mentioned about the story, right? And it's stories like this that we need to train the middle managers, and that's what we can do. And middle managers will then train the employees. So ultimately, middle managers are the ones who have the most touch points with the teams, and employees see what middle managers do, right? And they would emulate and copy what management does. So other than the training, I think secondly, we need to have the right reporting tools as well, right? The right data to show whether our middle managers are doing the right things, right? And regulators are interested in the effectiveness of our ENC program across the 4 pillars: risk identification, assessment, monitoring, and lastly, the reporting. And I think the risk reporting, the pillar 4 of the risk management lifecycle, is important because it informs management how effective the program is, and having the right data in the reporting. So right data meaning that, do we track, what is the severity of the conduct levels? What kind of conduct it is? Is it people treatment, violation of policy, or is it a serious falsification of company records? And do we have data by business unit, by country, legal entity, to show the data and the trends and the severity? And providing this data to management will show them, okay, how are we doing in terms of the report card for our legal entity? Do we have, is there an improving trend? Do we have to be worried? Do we have to do more training for our teams? So I think two points: having the right training and having the right report.
Thank you, June. Yeah, a really great points. I like your reference to practical training around scenarios and putting ethical frameworks into practice and giving middle management those tools. I think it's so powerful. Rather than just abstract concepts, how do you actually apply ethics to a commercial scenario that's realistic? Yeah, great stuff. And I think, Darja, before I come back to Eric for just his thoughts on your discussion, the cultural differences that we see across the Asia Pacific region. It's interesting you mentioned that you've seen the use of maybe more anonymous types of reporting, which may be more effective in some cultures where there's a real reluctance to maybe speak against someone that's seen as being disrespectful, or there's getting that speak up culture and that psychological safety that we hear so much about in the LRN report is very difficult or can be more challenging. And just bearing that in mind when you're making it easy for people to raise their concerns. And particularly I like the piece about measuring and when it comes to rewarding and evaluating performances, taking in these concepts, and that's a battle in firms to really get that embedded, but not just paying people purely on what they sell, but on the quality and the approach they've taken. Eric, what's your take on that big issue that came out about that disconnect with middle management and the comments you've heard from Darja and June?
No, as I said when I was presenting it, I think that this is the biggest red flag to me, because that gap is growing. And I think that is, as was discussed, probably due to a lot of commercial pressure. But also, I think it's in a lot of organizations, because we see the gap between the high and the middle. So the high are doing a pretty good job of the more mature programs, if you will, are doing a pretty good job. Because they're expending resources on training managers and giving them toolkits and providing them the information they need to cascade the importance of this. One other thing I would say is beyond having commercially applicable scenarios, which is really important, is also talking about how compliance actually saves money and affects the bottom line. We have lost opportunity costs if we have some sort of misconduct or something going on. So it is good business to make sure that we have an effective compliance program and we follow the rules. And that's something that can be really effective, that helping middle managers understand that, so that they know that they have these targets and these goals, and that one of the tools to get to the goals that they have is to make sure we don't have misconduct that's distracting and possibly derailing our business efforts. But also that they can also then explain that to their reports too, so that you make a business case for compliance. So arming the middle with that, that knowledge, so that they can go out and be, your local compliance officers, if you will, is really important. It doesn't matter. I mean, even with a relatively small organization of, say, a few hundred people, you could pour a lot of money at the top of the organization on a compliance program, buy a lot of tools, push out a lot of training, do a lot of stuff from top down. But if you don't have the buy-in on, the boots on the ground, that's a cultural thing. It's just not going to happen. And so that to me is really telling. And we've been preaching the gospel of engaging the middle for a long time, I think, as compliance officers. And the concern that I have with this data is that we're not seeing an improvement. We're seeing actually a divergence and things getting worse.
Yeah, Eric,
Yeah,
maybe
and
if
I see Mohammed has asked. Oh, please go
Sorry.
ahead.
Rebecca, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, Mohammed has just asked has asked a question in the chat about the role middle management plays in fostering that culture. I mean, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. I mean, in a practical, what should they be doing? Are they kind of reinforcing the messages from the top? Are they giving more practical insights to their people? I don't know, Darja, you had the mic before I rudely took it away, so I'll pass to you.
No worries. Well, look, I think that there are different tools out there, obviously, and we probably already mentioned a few. But I think the thing that has to sit before we actually turn to those tools is some kind of organizational trust in a fair process as a concept, right? So I had a few people coming to me saying from the middle management in Asia, look, I want to do the right thing. But let's be real, if a top performer or a senior manager breaks a rule, nothing happens. But if I, in my position now, push back or say a word, my career is over here. I will take a hit for everything that happened, right? And that's exactly actually what LRN data showed, right? When we asked employees if high performers are held to the same standards as everyone else, basically the response varies wildly depending on who is being asked. So I think executive thought that the company basically was fair, but middle managers, in my experience, always feel that they're the weak chain and they're gonna take the blame if something happens. So I think the first step in order to help middle managers, we have to reverse that reality. And one of the tools I could think of from experience is a so-called blind review. So we actually submitted the misconduct cases to our senior leadership without telling them who the employee was, without their job title or gender or performance data, and asked them for their objective opinion and decision. And only afterwards, we submitted their actual name and surname. So we kind of tried to prevent that subconscious bias and injustice that was so widely talked about, unfortunately, on the middle level.
Yeah, I mean, just
Fantastic.
to add as well, Darja, you mentioned about something about human tendencies, right? So, I mean, it's human, right? And we have confirmation bias. We favor data that supports our view. There's ethical fading. If we think something is common practice, we relax our standard. And there's also the tendency for humans to rationalize, right? I'm only following orders, and I need to perform, and by performing, maybe this could be compromised, and that's good for the organization. Again, it's kind of a rationalization. So I think, how do we correct that? It's having the right ethical decision-making framework in place. Questions what we use in an organization, 5 key questions. So if challenged publicly, would I be comfortable sharing details? That's question number 1. Number 2, is it fair and honest? 3, what would happen if everybody did it? And 4, does it put long-term relationships at risk for short-term gain? And 5, which is foundational, is it lawful and within the letter and spirit of our policies? So we provide a framework and we train on a framework, with real case studies. And getting them to think through, okay, in this scenario, right? For example, you have a client comes to you, and the client asks, can you give a job to my son? This kind of cases, and we will run them through the 5 questions. What would you do, right? You've challenged publicly, Is it fair and honest? And if you did it, what does it mean? Does it put long-term relationship and short-term gain? So yeah, these are the kind of cases that we go through.
That's brilliant, June. And I've seen several examples very similar to that approach in large institutions with that kind of framework of questioning. I know NatWest in the UK, NatWest Group has a very similar framework. I've often heard it described as the grandma test. Would I feel comfortable explaining this decision to my grandma? But yeah, a really good point. But one thing I did want to explore, panel, well, there's a couple of things I definitely want to explore before maybe we take some questions. One is data. And this is obviously a big part of what LRN does and comes out really strongly in the report that the high performing programs are pulling away because they're using data to base the whole ethics compliance program. So I just wanted to get your view on how what does it actually look like? What sort of data? How do we find this data? And especially around benchmarking, because how do we compare our organization, with another organization and so forth? So just your thoughts on that, panel. Darja, I might start with you, then we'll go around just talking about maybe the use of data or key risk indicators and how you think that can be used.
Sure, Pekka. Well, look, I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to maybe share the very best practice on the benchmarking. I do feel, I have a strong feeling Asia is still lagging behind slightly in terms of benchmarking. And I think it also lies in the culture. So my favorite data point, and I think everyone are already there with their compliance program, is the whistleblower reporting. It's the easiest data point one can obtain. I think there are a bunch of organizations nowadays that publish whistleblower reporting data. So it's a data point that's just available, right? So the risk there is obviously in Asia as a company, as a culturally, I think we're all more into consensus, into sort of being calm, not really talking about our problems that much, right? So often the reaction on those data points from the leadership is, oh, is something wrong? Why do we have so many reports? Why are the numbers going up, right? So, but rather than the panic, what we did, we dug into this data. And I think it's important not just to look at it generically, right? It's very helpful to understand what types of issues are being flagged. Is it isolated or systematic? So where exactly is it coming from? Is it a specific country or specific department, right? That's the way we can sort of look at the patterns and be clear if something can be done about it, right? So I think if we are talking data, unfortunately, I personally can't share a great example of benchmarking at this point, but I'm sure June will be able to share her experiences maybe. We pretty much rely a lot on the whistleblower data reports at this point.
I know Eric will have some good insight into that as well. And I think, June, your thoughts on the use of data and maybe benchmarking and KRIs?
Benchmarking, we don't really do kind of a formal benchmarking. So, having kind of surveys, like from Eric, those would be, good data points for us to review as to how we're doing and, whether we fall into the high impact programs, medium impact programs. I think such reports will inform. And I think it's also through informal sharing with a network, of your compliance practitioners about best practices, what is the organization doing. I think this is a form of benchmarking that, we do. On data, I think I mentioned some of the, the conduct stats that we track on a reporting pillar. Another, other than whistleblowing, which we do as well, there's another data point that we track, which is the speak up report. So we do have a speak up line, right? So we actually track the number of speak ups, the trends, whether the speak ups are anonymous or not, because it does show the comfort level over time. If the anonymity drops, it does show perhaps indicate that employees are trusting the organization more to provide their name. They're trusting the organization to do the right thing. And recently we added an additional data point, which is, are these pickup cases, what is the substantiation rate? Meaning that are all of them real conduct cases or not all of them? Because it does show as well, maybe the certain level of understanding by employees of what is conduct, what is not.
Yeah, and I think as well, some of the other points around training and how people are engaging with codes of conduct, for example, is something I know Eric will have a view on. But for example, I know there's work being done now on, look, you know, you can tell me that 97% of your staff have done training, but what is the level of retention? What is the changes in behavior? How are you sampling that as well? And I know, Eric, you know, LRN's got some really interesting ideas about how to track that sort of stuff, as well as, you know, how are people engaging with your codes of conduct? Where are they looking? And obviously technology can help with this as well, but maybe can you give us your thoughts on the use of data and maybe things like benchmarking?
Sure. I mean, I think obviously I represent an organization that collects a lot of proprietary data and offers a lot of tools, including tools for measurement. But you know, let's be realistic. Some organizations just don't have the budget for that right now. Maybe you will in the future, but you don't right now. So if you don't have the budget right now, things like our PE report, and there are other organizations that put out reports periodically on either survey data or benchmarking data that you can glean a little bit from. And then just to give you another example, let's talk about code of conduct. Maybe you don't have the resources right now to invest in a tool that's going to track usage and the what's going on with your code of conduct, like like LRN and other organizations can offer. But what you can do is publicly traded companies have to put their code of conduct on their website. So you can go and gather up, 20, 30, 40 codes of conduct from peer organizations and do your own benchmarking. So there are ways to on a budget, a tight budget, do some informal benchmarking. But when you do make the case and you do get the budget you want, there are lots of tools that help you manage what data you're getting from training, what data you're getting from people using your resources like your code of conduct. And also there are tools and systems to monitor third parties. So you can get very sophisticated, and you can spend a lot of budget on that. But start, like I said at the end of the presentation, start with what you have. What can you measure now? Is it misconduct data on the hotline or helpline, or what's being reported to HR or other parts of the organization? Start there. Start with what you have. If you want to do some initial benchmarking, maybe benchmark your code of conduct and your other written standards with what's publicly available out there and go through that exercise. So there are ways to do it on a budget. But if you're one of the lucky few that convince the board to open up the budget for you, there are lots of really helpful tools out there now too.
Brilliant. Thank you. And I will see Nick. Hi, Nick. Nick has asked, what do you think are the most bang for buck KPIs benchmarks? So I think you've kind of addressed that in your answer there. I do want to also, panel, focus on this generational thing. I find this fascinating, and I wanted to get your thoughts on the generational gap, maybe cultural gap. And there's been quite a few questions come in related to that aspect. You'll see in the chat. So I just looking at the questions. So Sue has asked, thanks, Sue. Do you think Gen Z has a higher standards of ethical decision-making, or is it a misconception due to cultural differences? I think there was another one as well, wasn't there? How do we encourage, Alan? Thank you, Alan. How do we encourage younger employees or rank and file to embrace the compliance and ethics? So panel, this generational thing. I'm squarely, as I move into my 50s, I'm squarely in the Gen X category, I guess. I'm not going to hit anyone down as to which category you're in, but what are your thoughts on the findings there, and how maybe can we and should we be addressing those findings? So Darja, should we start with you, and then June, and then we'll come to we'll come back full circle to Eric.
Sure. Look, this topic makes me feel old. I agree with you. I don't even know how my generation is called anymore. So I think the rule there is we should stop resisting. I think there's a lot of conversations around well, Gen Zs, they're so spoiled, or they're so mistrustful, or this or that, right? But that's just the reality. That's every generation before Gen Zs were saying the same thing, right? So if we want them engaged, we need to meet them where they are, so to say. So I was working, on rolling out the standard ethics training, and the seasoned employees were all in, like good students, taking notes, nodding along, and Gen Zs, obviously not so much. So I kind of felt something needs to be done about it, because half of the audience is falling asleep constantly. So it totally makes sense that we get the data we get from the LRN reports. And I think the main issue here definitely is trust. While we sort of unconditionally come into a workplace with the mindset, we trust our employer, we believe they would do the right thing, right? They have good programs in place. They just don't approach this the same way, right? We have to show them we are worthy. We have to show them that actions, not just the words, right? That this is the generation that prefers action to words. So instead of forcing, I think, another round of kind of click here and acknowledge the code of conduct training, we decided to switch things up, and we introduced sort of a peer-led discussions. Believe it or not, we invited a DJ to make it slightly more fun and engaging for the Gen Zs. And it was more of a talk, a conversation, rather than a lecture and a classical training. And honestly, they were excited, they were engaged, and so on. We also set up an anonymous chatbot for the reporting. Let's be honest, Gen Zs would rather text a bot than raise their hand in a meeting, right? That's just a generational thing. And again, engagement went up. So I don't really think it's fair to say younger employees don't care about ethics or compliance. I think they just don't believe in corporate lip service. They want to see actions, and we have to gain their trust in a way.
Yeah, really interesting examples. June, what's your take on this, the generational findings and what we can do about it?
Yeah, I think what Darja said is spot on. We have to make the training relatable to the Gen Zs. I think a couple of things. Firstly, gamification, right, in training. So we've introduced actually games, and they do online. They go through the games, and also a storyline where we start with so for example John, or walking through the different stories. I think that we've got good feedback from our younger employees. So I think it's been how to make it relatable to them.
Making it relatable, tailoring. We were discussing before, June, I think, about have we perhaps just tried to treat all of our employees as the same personality type, same generation? Maybe we need to start tailoring, being much more aware of some of these issues.
Yeah, and I also add that they want to have that personal touch as well, right? They don't want, as you mentioned, lip service. They don't want lip service. So we have more regular town halls, management meetings. We get senior management to come to speak to employee population. Talking about risk excellence culture. Talking about what are the expectations from management and what you should be doing. So they want to see management walk the floor, rather than sitting behind an office, and it makes it relatable to them, and to show that management cares about them.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, June. Eric, what's your thoughts on the generational findings and maybe our response, or what it could be?
The kind of divergence that we see in our data, particularly in this most recent report, I kind of want to pair it with the finding of that the initial first point, which is the gap between middle and perception of middle management and executive decision making. I think some of this might be because Gen Z is more junior. They're interfacing more with middle. And so their perception is really informed by this gap that we see in less mature programs where the middle is not engaged, where middle management is not leading by example and not trying to promote compliance in the way we'd like to see. So I like to think that maybe Gen Z is a little bit more like us than what maybe the first blush of the data suggests. I think having different ways to approach different learners, whether they, whether it's a generational difference or just a different way of learning, is important. That we don't try to do one size fits all in our training or in our programming for compliance. But I think maybe what we're seeing with Gen Z is they're on the front lines because they're the more junior employees in these organizations, and so they see how the sausage is being made, as they say, and so perhaps that is what's informing their more negative perceptions.
Yeah, interesting perspective, Eric. So some other questions coming in panel, if I may. Here's one specifically just coming from Mahmoud. Thank you, Mahmoud. And this is a really interesting one, given that there are people from many jurisdictions on this call. And Mahmoud asks, how do you guarantee protection of whistleblowers in communities that have weak judicial systems? And there is a really divergent legal set of frameworks around the Asia-Pacific region and the world. And there's been a couple of related questions. Alan has asked about, in reporting, we have an anti-retaliation policy, but some staff are questioning how efficient this is. So I just wonder, in kind of general terms, without getting into the specifics of different legal frameworks panel, how do we give people more confidence, and how do we try and give people that, psychological safety that actually, if they do speak up, even in jurisdictions where perhaps there isn't that legal framework of protection, that they will be protected? How do we build that trust? I mean, it's not an easy question to answer, but June, I might come to you first this time. Do you have any thoughts on that? And then we'll go around the panel.
Yeah, I think firstly, have the policy. I think someone mentioned about the anti-retaliation policy. Have that framework and policy in place. I think that's the first step. Secondly, getting awareness, generating awareness of the policy through training, so that employees know that, okay, we have this anti-retaliation policy in place. How am I protected? And thirdly, it's to share report, on your speak up line, and to share, audit results of your speak up line to show, how your speak up line is in compliance with the anti-retaliation policy. That is another avenue, a tool, right, to get employees confidence in speaking up.
Fantastic. Darja, your thoughts on that quite thorny issue?
Sure. I think June definitely nailed it all with her answer. But I guess speaking of the anti-retaliation as a concept, as a corporate compliance concept, in many companies, what I've seen is it's just a policy, unfortunately, right? So there is an anti-retaliation policy, or there's somewhere 2 sentences about it, but again, there's no program. So I think the solution there is definitely to make a policy actionable, right? And to provide the proof to employees that there is that organizational justice we talked about previously. Presenting examples from the corporate practice, presenting a good disciplinary system, making sure the anonymous reporting is effective. All of that would, I think, contribute to the protection in the countries with the specific issues.
Yeah, what a powerful message it sends. I guess if you're a young person just joined an organization and you see a real case being publicized, albeit anonymized, that it's okay to speak up and you will be protected. Eric, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would amplify, confidence in the system and spending some time communicating what you do and why you do it, and how the anti-retaliation stance of the organization is enforced, but also anonymous reporting mechanisms. When I started 13, 14 years ago, outside the United States, anonymous reporting mechanisms either were not allowed in certain jurisdictions in Europe in particular, or were not favored. I think that it's still in certain regions of the world, including APAC, is not widely adopted. But if you are in a jurisdiction where it is legal to have an anonymous reporting mechanism, and that is another way to encourage people to come forward when they have those fears, and maybe they don't completely believe that sticking their hand up is going to be accepted either within the culture of the organization or outside the organization. Having an anonymous reporting mechanism can allow them to have that outlet and feel like they have an opportunity to make that report, but also, the organization is also going to get that information that they might not otherwise get.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Panel, we are at time, I believe. So it's gone very quick. As always, I think it's been a really interesting topic, and there's so much more we could talk about. I'm sure we'll be doing more collaborative sessions with LRN, and they really do some really fascinating and useful work. So I just want to finish up by saying thank you very much to all of our panel today. Eric, June, and Darja, thank you so much, guys. It was an absolute pleasure chatting with you. And thank you very much to our audience. Some great questions, and apologies if we didn't get a chance to answer all of your questions. Thank you very much for joining us, and do look out for the next ICA webinar coming up shortly. Panel, have a great rest of your day, and everyone, wherever you are in the world, stay safe and well. Thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.